It's 11 o'clock. Do you know where your children are?
They are drawings that give you an inside look into the mind of a killer executed 20 years ago. Experts say they prove he would have been a danger to society if he got out of prison. A former news anchor worked 30 years to close the book on the Omaha area's most notorious child killer, John Joubert. For the first time, the public will see the horrific drawings Joubert made while on death row.
Former KMTV anchor Mark Pettit interviewed Joubert 7 times in the 1980s and wrote the book A Need to Kill. He's now reissuing the book with the drawings that experts say prove Joubert would have killed again.
Welcome, one and all. Dear listeners, this is our season premiere of the Necronomicast. As we begin this 7th season, we take a step back from the horror of Hollywood to explore something even more horrifying. Our guest tonight is the 3-time Emmy-winning journalist and author Mark Pettit. 30 years ago, Mark had the opportunity to exclusively interview the most sadistic serial killer in Nebraska history, John Joubert. Those interviews and Mark's drive as a reporter led to his book, A Need to Kill. Startling revelations about that case have now recently come to light. Award-winning journalist and author Mark Pettit, he's our guest on this special episode of the Necronomicast. Here we are calling in from Atlanta, Georgia, Emmy Award-winning journalist and author, Mr. Mark Pettit. Mark, how are you tonight?
I'm doing great, Brian. How are you? And thank you so much for having me on your program.
Well, I'm doing great. I'm very excited to be talking to you. Considering the subject matter, excited might not be the right word, but I'm really looking forward to this conversation because in our correspondence between me and your assistant, I was talking about how, the John Joubert case for us here in Nebraska, it rocked us to our core. It really did. And I remember being a child when all that was going on. And I was wondering how I was going to start, this conversation with you about your time in Omaha, the murders, the trial, your interviews, all that. And I wanted to start off with reading just a little bit from page 14 of your introduction of the copy that I have of your book. And it starts off, "The fear John Joubert instilled in the people of Nebraska is still evident today. Young children look over their shoulders more than they should. Parents hold their children's hands a bit tighter than other parents normally would." Here we are in 2017, decades after this crime, after the trial, after all that, and it still resonates. That name still resonates here in Omaha. So, Mark, a little bit about yourself. You were working for KMTV3 here in Omaha in the 80s. Where are you from originally?
I'm from Calhoun, Georgia, which is about an hour north of Atlanta. And Brian, you lived through this in Omaha. I grew up near Atlanta, as I mentioned, during the time of the Atlanta missing and murdered children's case. Are you familiar, or do you remember what happened back in 1979 and 81 here?
Oh, sure. I've read about that. Yeah, you bet. Yeah.
So, long story short, 28 children, teens, and adults were kidnapped and murdered over a 2-year period. So I knew the fear that was in this community. The 11 o'clock news would start here with an announcer saying, "It's 11 o'clock. Do you know where your children are?" And so I grew up with that. And when I got to Nebraska, and shortly, I arrived in 1984 to be the weekend anchor and investigative reporter at KMTV. And when I got there and learned about the Joubert case, I was like, oh my God, this is the exact same paralyzing fear that we felt in Georgia and Metro Atlanta when the crimes happened here. So something that really struck me, the late Sheriff Pat Thomas, you might remember him, the Sarpy County Sheriff, he led the search for John Joubert. He told me during one of our interviews that it was a fear like he had never seen before and that he hoped he never saw again in the community. That city in that area was paralyzed by fear, and I later learned that John Joubert very much enjoyed instilling that fear in the people of Nebraska.
Yeah, I was at a Christmas party at a friend's house just over the holidays. And he lives in a beautiful new subdivision right near 102nd and Giles. And there's an industrial area, beautiful houses that are being built there and everything. And I couldn't help but remember just driving around 108th and Giles on the way to my friend's house. And just, 30 years later, it still sent a chill in my spine. And not to be a downer at a Christmas party, but people know that I do the show. And people were asking me, hey, what's going on with the show? What are you going to do? And I said, well, I just actually got in contact with Mark Pettit, who wrote a book about John Joubert. And people... I laugh, but people were not stunned, but I mean, his name resonated in the room, John Joubert, and people were like, oh, and everybody had like a story about being in Bellevue and living not too far from the house, or my parents worked with their parents, and, it struck me again what this crime did to this community 30 years ago. And that's all the subject in your book, A Need to Kill. And Mark, the reason that we got you on the show, you've made some news with a new released version of your book that includes some of John Joubert's death row drawings. And there's a lot of story behind that, and we'll get to that. So did you ever think 30 years ago that you're writing this book or putting it together or interviewing Joubert that it would, the kind of legacy would still stand 30 years later?
No, to be honest, Brian, I didn't. And I think going into any project like this, you have to be a bit naive. I've been covering the case since 1984. I was very fascinated for a couple of reasons. One, John Joubert and I were basically the same age. He was born a month before me in 1963. So there we were, the same age. I was very fascinated that a young man like him, who had been an Eagle Scout and a U.S. Airman, could have gone down this horrible path. And so I was naturally curious about how this could happen. And as I said, coming from the background of the missing and murdered children's case in Atlanta, I was very interested in putting together the pieces of how this happened. So no, I really didn't think it would we'd be talking about this 30 years later. The prosecutor in the case told me at one point, Mark, you know more about this case than anybody besides Joubert. You should write a book about it. And I said, okay, I'm going to do that. And, I was going to school at UNO. I was doing the news in the evening. And I just took on this assignment that I'm going to write a book about this. And the police and the courts were very helpful. They actually gave me all the evidence in the case. A lot of people don't know this, but I had boxes of evidence at my home that the knife, the rope, the autopsy photos, every piece of evidence in the case was in my home for a year as I analyzed and worked to piece together the puzzle. The families were very kind. Danny Jo Eberle's parents, Christopher Walden's parents, to talk to me about their sons and about how this had affected their families. And during the interviews with Joubert, I learned more and more and was able to piece together a string of crimes that had gone unsolved, including the murder of Ricky Stetson, which had happened a year before Joubert came to Omaha. So I think it was much more than I expected. It was much tougher than I expected to write this book. But in doing so, I was able to solve a lot of crimes, piece together a third murder, and I think help investigators, put this twisted puzzle together.
That's amazing, that they allowed you to have the evidence. I mean, I don't know if they would do something like that nowadays, but you had the actual knife and the rope and all that as you were researching. You had that in kind of your custody, so you could...
Everything, yeah.
Amazing.
I think the police trusted me. I think the courts trusted me, the prosecutors. Lee Polikoff, who is now the district attorney in Sarpy County, we go back a long way. So I think that they trusted me, that I was trying to get to the bottom of the case, to tell the story accurately, and they wanted to help me. And like I said, Sheriff Pat Thomas could not have been more helpful. And, Joubert, I think there were questions in his mind of why he did some of the things he did. And it was a chess game. We talked 7 times at the penitentiary in Nebraska, down in Lincoln. No guards in the room. It was me and him at a conference table. And sometimes cat and mouse, he would say, have you thought about this? Did you look into that? And, I think we built a bond in a weird way where he trusted me as well and told me things he probably shouldn't have told me that later came out in the book.
And what I appreciate about the book, a lot of crime books are, they're gory or they're repulsive or they try and make the crime sensationalistic. But I thought you did a really great job. And like you said, you talked to the families, and I'm sure you were working closely with them to make sure that, you were sensitive. You're trying to get the facts of the case out, the facts of the trial, but at the same time, you had a sensitivity that I thought it's very apparent with the book and just how the ripple effects of the whole case, the trial, everything, the ripple effects on the families, the community, the law enforcement. You do a great job writing about the stress and the toll that it took on the law enforcement. It's a remarkable book. And you met with Joubert 7 times. And what's also neat about your book, you have reproductions of the letters, the handwritten letters that he wrote to you. What's it like getting mail from the Nebraska State Pen with John Joubert on the return address? That's got to be chilling.
Very interesting. I'll tell you how it went down. I tried to go through Joubert's attorney at the time, and he was adamant that I not talk with him, that he felt that it would jeopardize his appeals and so forth. So I decided to write Joubert directly. So you'll read the letters in the book, what I said to him, and I included a self-addressed stamped envelope, with a KMTB3 envelope that you'll see in the book. Mm-hmm. And I really didn't know whether he would respond. And 2 weeks after I sent the first letter to him, the return envelope came back, and KMTV's address was scratched out, and his name and prison number were written above where the station's address was. And I just took the letter back. I got it out of my mailbox, and I walked to an editing room at the TV station, and I had a sense at that moment that he wasn't going to agree to the interview. But you'll read the letter, and you see his handwriting. The penmanship is incredible. And that shows a level of intelligence. What I've learned is you can tell a lot by people's handwriting. And he was very intelligent, very smart, and thoughtful. When you read the letter, what he said back to me, it was like, why do you think, while I appreciate that you think this would help someone else, why do you think people would say it's not a ploy to gain our sympathy? So just very intellectual and thoughtful. But he said in the letter that while I'm not going to agree to the interview, I'd be open to you coming here and us meeting in person and talking about it. And so I took that opportunity. I drove down by myself, no camera crew, and just met with him one-on-one the first time. And I remember walking into the prison, and the prison guard said to me, "Are you nervous?" And I said, "A little." And he said, "It's okay once you get past his eyes." And when I got in the room with Joubert, when he walked in, you expect this killer to be overbearing or, and he wasn't. He was small, frumpy, dumpy even. But his eyes were cold and gray. I'll never forget it. And that's what they meant, is once you get past his eyes, it's fine.
So you mentioned earlier that you were pretty close in age to him. So so this is like one of your first real, investigative journalistic endeavors was to go. I mean, you really jumped right into it, investigating, one of the most notorious killers in the Midwest.
It was a huge deal. It's like going fishing and catching a whale the first outing, right? And again, part of it was naive. I didn't understand what I was getting into, but I wanted to get to the bottom of it. I wanted to get to the truth. Those are two things that have always driven me, journalism and justice. And so I felt an obligation. When you say that the tone of the book that you appreciate, I felt a great deal of responsibility. I felt that the parents were telling me the most intimate details of their most horrific moment in life, right? I felt the police were telling me things that were happening to them, and they were on the verge of nervous breakdowns, and the stress was unbelievable. So I felt an incredible responsibility to tell the story in a straightforward manner that told it from all sides. So once I got into it, I felt like this was my duty, was to tell the story in the most thorough and compelling way possible. And one of the interviews with Joubert, as you'll read in the book, when he basically confessed to the murder of Ricky Stetson, I said two things. One, how I got the title of the book. I said, John, you didn't know these boys. Why did you do this? And he said, Mark, as long as I can remember, I've just had a need to kill. And that the hair stood up on my arms. It was just like, it gave me cold chills. And then when I said to him, John, did you kill Ricky Stetson? He paused and he turned off my tape recorder and he said, listen, I'm not going to tell you I didn't do it, but the last time I pled guilty to anything, I got the death penalty. So I felt that he was also so invested in the process of telling me the story that he wasn't going to lie to me. But he didn't want it on the record, and that's why he stopped the tape recorder. But, you know, I had a responsibility to report what he said, and I just repeated what he said, and that's how the investigators solved the murder of Ricky Stetson in Portland.
Yeah, when you said that quote of I can't lie to you, I can't say I didn't do it, you actually had that as a pull quote on the beginning of chapter 10, and I was going to talk about that. Your blood must have ran cold when he reached over and turned off the tape recorder. So these interviews were tape recorded?
Yes, they were.
Do you still have the tapes?
I do, yes.
Oh, my goodness.
So it's, you know, I've held on to all this evidence for a long time. And getting to the point of where we are on the death row drawings, during one of our last interviews, Joubert told me that he was still fantasizing about killing more kids. And I said, John, you're on death row. How can you be thinking about killing more kids? And he said, I know, and it's troubling, and I've been drawing them out. And I said, what do you mean drawing them out? He said, the prison confiscated 2 of the drawings that I made earlier this year. And I said, so they took them from you? He said, yeah, they raided my cell basically during a routine shakedown, and they found the drawings. And I said to him, you know this is not normal. Something's very, very wrong with you. Why don't you let me get those drawings, and I will get them analyzed by a professional, a psychiatrist or a behavioral scientist? And he said, I would like that. So you'll see in the book, he took out a piece of paper from my yellow notepad, and he wrote a letter to the prison warden giving them permission to turn the drawings over to me, and signed it. And you'll see it. I've held on to all this stuff for a long time. And the prison system refused to turn over the drawings back when this happened. And it bothered me for all these years that I'd known about these drawings but didn't get my hands on them. So for me, this was literally the stone left unturned in this case. I felt like I had evidence that he was still fantasizing about killing more kids. And what people didn't know is that Joubert had worked with the FBI many years after he was sentenced to die. He met with the FBI and the criminal profilers 6 or 7 more times, talking to them about what it was like to be a killer, helping them get into the minds of a killer. He even offered to go to crime scenes to help the FBI solve unsolved murders. And he told me, Mark, I'm working with the FBI. I'm going to get out someday. And I said, John, you're on death row. And he said, I know, but I'm helping the police. I'm going to get out. And so the dichotomy of him thinking on one hand he was going to get out of prison someday, and on the second hand, he's drawing more killings, that's what drove me for all those years to try to get the drawings. And that's what happened with the 30th anniversary coming up in early 2013. I went back to the prison system and said, listen, he told me about these drawings way back in 1988. Do you still have them? They went back through the files, and I was blown away when they called me back and said, we found them. We have the drawings. Oh. And I was like, you still have them? And they said, yes. And I said, can you describe them to me? And the general counsel was saying, yes, they're horrible. One is of a boy on his hands and knees. He's bound with rope. His mouth is bound, and a dark-haired man is standing over him, stabbing him in the stomach. And he said the second one is like the boy is floating. He's tied up. He's nude as well, and there's this look of fear on his face. And I said to the general counsel, George, give me those drawings. Let me get them analyzed. Let me figure out what was behind this. And for some reason, they refused at that time to give them up. And I talked to the prosecutor, Lee Polikoff, and he said, Mark, this should be made public. And he helped me introduce me to a lawyer in Lincoln, Bob Krieger. And Bob courageously helped me go after the drawings. And that's how all this started. We actually won the court case. The initial court hearing before a district court judge, he ordered the prison to release the drawings within 60 days. And during that time frame, that's when then Attorney General John Bruning decided to appeal, and the case went on to the Nebraska Supreme Court.
And it wasn't quite the road that you were expecting. And so after Bruning filed the appeal, went all the way to the state and Supreme Court, they still denied it, didn't they?
Well, here's what happened. During the time between the district court ruling in Lincoln and the Supreme Court hearing, I was contacted by a confidential source, and this was late on a Saturday night. For some reason, I was home that night, and this person called me, and I answered the phone, and he said, is this Mark Pettit? And I said, yes. He said, the one that wrote the book about John Joubert. And I thought it was one of my friends from Nebraska, yanking my chain. And I said, yes. And he said, the one that's trying to get those drawings. And I said, yes. And he said, I have them, and I'm going to give them to you.
Amazing.
And I can't describe the feeling, the emotion that I was feeling at that moment. And in the latest version of the book, which is called A Need to Kill, the Death Row Drawings, I describe what happened next. When I was trying to make sure that this was for real, and I asked him, did he have a scanner? I was like, do you have a scanner at home? Can you make copies of these? And he said, Mark, I'm not that technical. Let me talk to you. Let me talk to my wife. And she gets on the phone, and we're talking, and I said, do you have a scanner? Can you possibly take pictures of the pictures? And she said, no, we don't have that. And then it hit me. I said, do you have a camera phone? And she said, I do. I said, do you know how to use it? And she said, I do. And I said, okay, what I'd like you to do is lay the drawings out on a table and take individual photos, and here's how to send them to me. And I gave her the address of where to send them to me. And she said, okay, I think I can do that. So, Brian, in that 5 minutes of when the phone clicked, I grabbed my pad and started writing how I was feeling at that very moment. Could this be it? After 30 years, could this be the final piece of this puzzle? And then the ding. I'd write in the book of how, you hear the ding of a new message on your phone or your computer. And I clicked on the first image, and it was the boy on his knees being stabbed. I clicked on the second image, and it was the floating boy. And I was like, this is it. And this was right before the Nebraska Supreme Court hearing. So, and you'll read all this in the new version of the book, but I had the drawings in my briefcase during the Supreme Court hearing. So it was almost surreal that I check in, they check my bags, we go into the courtroom, and I knew that no matter what happened, I had the drawings in my briefcase. So I thought Bob did a fantastic job of arguing their case. Afterwards, he said, I think on the merit we've won, but if they are worried about rewriting the law, you've lost. And that's what happened. They were worried about the intent of the state legislature that inmate records should be confidential. And unfortunately, they ruled against us and overturned the lower court's decision. So what people don't know is I had the drawings. I held on to them for another year. As you know, the death penalty was back on the ballot in Nebraska this past November.
That's right. And
I didn't want to interfere with that process. I didn't want to do something that alienated the court, that I violated their ruling. So I waited, and after the election, after the death penalty was reinstated, I made the decision that I couldn't keep this information private any further, and decided to have the drawings analyzed by an expert. And I was introduced to a gentleman by the name of Keith Howard, who's one of the nation's leading behavioral profilers. He studied at the FBI of what these drawings mean. And Keith was kind enough to take on the case, and you'll get a full reading of what the drawings mean. And it's awful. Joubert was what is known as a sexual sadist. what he did was designed to elicit the most fear as possible. So you'll actually see the drawings in the book, and I'd ask you to look closely at the drawings. The boys have no blindfolds on, but they have gags around their mouths. And I said, Keith, what does this mean? And he said, Mark, he wanted them to see everything, but not be able to say anything. He wanted them to be so frightened of what was happening. He wanted them to watch him kill them in the drawing. So it's awful. And knowing what I know now, these drawings should have been made public years ago, because the FBI was interviewing Joubert, and the prison had these drawings and did not turn them over. So I think that's appalling that these should have been made public years ago, and it's a shame that I had to go to the expense and all this time to get them made public, but I'm so thankful for the courage of the confidential source who came forward and made the drawings public.
That is an act of courage, and I agree with you 100% that something like that should be released, depending on the subject matter of the drawing. I don't know if it needs to be, like mass and put out there for mass consumption by the public, but it definitely needs to be researched. It needs to be investigated. They need to take a look at these things and see why somebody would do this. And I'm just struck by a couple of parallels. Like, I'm calling you from the land of Boys Town, of Father Flanagan. Father Flanagan, who said, "There's no such thing as a bad boy. There's no such thing as bad boy." But reading your book and knowing what I know about the case, Joubert was having these fantasies. He was having this need to kill since he was like 5 or 6. And what was he born that way? I mean, I was trying to look and see if there was. I know he had a rough childhood, with his mom and dad getting divorced and whatnot, but I didn't know if there was sexual abuse in the background. I know he was bullied a lot because of his size and stature, but I was just trying to think what at 6 years old makes a boy think about killing his babysitter and eating her. Absolutely frightening.
It's horrible. And I respect the work of Father Flanagan and what's happened at Boys Town. But unfortunately, now I know that there are bad people in this world. There are some people that are very evil. And I think what I've learned here is that some people are beyond redemption. And I think John Joubert was one of those people. He told me it was like a science experiment, like almost turning on and off the electricity. He could turn off the electricity and they would be gone. So I think that these victims to him were experiments. He was completely devoid of feelings. But when you look at the drawings, Brian, in the book that are released, you're going to notice that the killer in drawing number 1 has his hand on the boy's shoulder. And I asked the criminal profiler, what is this about? And he said, Mark, that's an act of intimacy. He wants to touch the victim. He wants to have a connection with them. But next in his mind is scaring them literally to death. He wants to elicit this fear, and then it becomes a sexual act for Joubert. As you'll read in the book, he would commit these crimes and then go masturbate. So it's just a really sick mindset of an individual that could do this kind of thing, but it was sexually driven. Once you understand the profile and what the drawings mean, it makes perfect sense. Because in the previous psychological profiles, Joubert was never identified as a pedophile, but as a sexual sadist. But even though he technically did not have sex with these boys, the fact that they were 5 years younger than him classifies him as a pedophile.
Yeah, and he was.
So I think.
I'm sorry. I was going to say, yeah, and he was getting aroused by the fear that he instilled in them,
absolutely.
And then it's haunting in the book where you're talking about he replays their screams or the fear as he's kind of reliving the crime.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you said these were experiments, I mean, he started off stabbing one girl with a pencil, and then later attacked a college professor, and then Ricky Stetson. That was his first murder in Maine back in 1982, and he joined the Air Force to kind of get out of there. So he was each crime was getting progressively worse. He was getting more bold with what he was doing. So he did stab the girl, the male college professor, and then the 3 boys that he killed. He also he went off to attack Barbara Weaver. Was she just at the wrong place, wrong time at that church in Bellevue?
Well, I think she was at the right place I think she was at the right place at the right time, Brian, to be honest. But let's step back and talk about that, because in the profile that Keith Howard compiled here for as he analyzed the drawings, he classified Joubert as an organized offender. And I had never heard of that before, but what that means is this person, they start out being sloppy, if you will, and the crimes become more sophisticated. They do things that are one step further. And the reason Keith Howard told me about that is that the actual crime is never as good as the fantasy that they're having, so that they feel they have to go back and perfect the crime, if that makes sense.
Oh, sure.
So you'll see that in these cases that Joubert went further and further to the point of biting the boys in Nebraska and then trying to cover up with knife marks what he had done. So I think that the crime was never as good as the fantasy, and he says that that's why a person like John Joubert and these drawings prove that they would have continued to kill to perfect the fantasy, and that there's no telling how many kids would have been killed before he was caught if he weren't caught in Nebraska.
Yeah, and he had a real specific MO too, in terms of, knife was his weapon of choice. You think that goes back to that intimacy that you're talking about, the hand on the shoulder, because you're not shooting somebody with a gun 10 feet away, you're actually thrusting the knife into them.
And when you read the accounts of what happened in the book, these were very intimate settings where he came up to both boys, put his arm around them, and then put the knife to their necks or their sides to get them into his vehicle. And I'll get to Barbara Weaver in just a second, but one thing that struck me about Danny Joe Eberly, his father said, we used to wrestle all the time, and I can't figure out why Danny didn't fight back. And it makes me think that Joubert might have known Danny in some way, that they might have met before at a gas station or a convenience store, so that there might be some reason that Danny wasn't as fearful of Joubert as he should have been, or didn't fight back like his family felt he should have, right? And Christopher Walden, it was just horrific. It was a very cold morning, snowfall, and when he kidnapped the little boy, he's down in the front seat of the car crying, begging Joubert to let him go. And Joubert said it was too late. I knew if I let him go, he would tell. Mm-hmm. And he marched that little boy into the woods in the freezing cold and made him strip down. And that was another thing. He made these boys strip down to their underwear. And I asked Keith Howard, why is that? And he said, that's part of it. He wants them to be so vulnerable, but it's also a sexual, exciting situation for Joubert. So that's why he thinks he made the boys strip to their underwear. But, if you think about how cold it was, and it's a horrible situation that these kids were put through. But for Joubert, it was all about satisfying a sexual desire. And like I said, a feeling that he had a need to kill since he was 5 years old.
Absolutely. You're telling me these things, and I'm reliving what I've just kind of, what I reread in the book. I was 9 when this was all going on. I turned 9 in October. Danny Joe Eberly was abducted in September, so I was 8, 9. And I remember, we didn't have internet. We only had channels 3, 6, and 7. We had the Omaha World Herald. And at 9 years old, this was the talk of the town. It was the talk of the community. You talked about it at restaurants. You talked about it at church. You talked about it on the street. You talked about it on the bus stop with your friends. And I remember being that age and being scared that this man was out there. There was the forensic sketch of the profile of the killer that's in your book. Mm-hmm. I remember that all over the place. And us kids, we didn't have access to, a printer or a photocopier. One of our friends had got it from Baker's. Somebody handed him a copy of the wanted poster, the forensic drawing of the killer, who they were looking for, the suspect. And us kids, we made flyers like putting a piece of paper over another piece of paper and copying, tracing, and just doing what we thought what we could do to help the community find this killer.
Well, you lived it. I mean, you were there, and that brings us back to Barbara Weaver. And, you know, I'm not an overly religious person, but I'm a spiritual person. And Barbara told me that, you know, she was the teacher at the preschool at the church. And she said that morning, just what you're talking about, that she talked with her kids that morning about what was happening and that they had to be careful. And she said that they prayed that morning, and she said, God, if you use me in some way to help, use me that I might help end this horrible nightmare. And then that's when Joubert came to the school that morning. And two things drove that. You asked about Barbara Weaver. Sheriff Pat Thomas was a very smart guy. He knew that Joubert was watching everything on Channel 3, 6, or 7, as you mentioned. And he would talk beyond the reporters directly into the camera and said to Joubert on a couple of occasions, if you're a man, pick on somebody your own size. Don't pick on a kid. And was trying to goad Joubert into making a mistake. And that's what happened that morning. I believe that Joubert was out looking for more children. But when he came up on the preschool and went to the door, Barbara Weaver was the school teacher. And he asked to use the phone. And she lied to him and said, there is no phone here. And that's when he tried to push the door, and she fought back. And she pushed back, and I think he stumbled. It was a icy morning. And he then got scared and started running to the car, and that's when she was able to get a partial tag number. But just interesting, like you said, Brian, you lived it. There was fear in that community. And Barbara Weaver, with her own children that morning that Joubert was arrested, that was the topic at the breakfast table, right? And then her saying in her prayers that, use me to help. And that's what happened. Barbara Weaver was in the right place at the right time, and that's the reason John Joubert was caught.
Oh, she showed extraordinary courage, and the fact that she kind of had that instinct that she saw this guy, and I've been to that that church, that Aldersgate Church, and I saw the building, and it's not a very big building. It's not a big mega church. It's small town Bellevue Church, and she saw this guy that just didn't fit out in the parking lot, either loitering or whatever he's doing, driving around.
Exactly.
And she had that instinct, she had that instinct to write down and memorize the serial number. And for her to pop out of that building and run like hell to the pastor's house, he wasn't a very big guy, but still, he's flashing a knife, and she knew in her heart that this was the evil that had come to their town.
She knew.
And just the locations of the murders and everything. Bellevue, it's a small town. I mean, it's part of Omaha, but small, narrow streets. The Pawnee Elementary School, very close to the church where Barbara Weaver was. Very close, not too far, 5 minutes away from the Eberle's house. Of course, Christopher Walden walked to school that day. For him to keep coming back to that area, he was, you said he was very intelligent in his IQ reports and everything. He must have just why that area? He just kept coming back to that same area. I thought that struck me as strange.
I think there was a level of confidence. I think he had a level of confidence that he would be successful in that area, right? Maybe not as heavy a police presence as you'd see in Omaha. But, one thing you talk about the fear to this day, when I interviewed Barbara Weaver, I flew out to California and met her, and she said, I still have a fear to this day, and this was when he was still alive, that he's going to get out of prison, and he's going to come after me or my kids to get back at what I did. And so just the ripple effect of the fear that Joubert instilled in 1983, 84 to 1996 when he was executed to today, that people still talk about this case, right?
Oh, absolutely. A couple months ago was Halloween, and when reading this book and thinking, I remember Halloween of 83. People were scared to death because, you had Johnny Gosh. He disappeared a year before in Des Moines, 2 hours away.
That's true.
Then Danny Joe, he was abducted and murdered at the end of September. Yeah, Halloween was really awful. And on North 90th Street, there was a Target store. And I remember, my mom, she'd say, we'd go to Target, and she'd say, okay, I'm going to go over here to get this. I'm going to go over here to layaway. I'm going to do this. And I'd say, well, can I go to the Halloween costumes and browse them, and then maybe go to the toys, the toy area. And I remember she said that was fine because we drove there together. We were, anyway, so I remember walking around the store and totally, paranoid, 9-year-old paranoia, 8-year-old paranoia. But every single man in there, he could have been the killer. And, it could have been a guy just walking around trying to figure out what toy to get his kid for, birthday or Christmas. But, when there was a single man in the toy aisle and I was there, chilled me to the bone. Absolutely chilled me to the bone. And my friends,
and how
too.
sad is that? I mean, it's sad. It robbed the community and you and people who live there of a certain innocence. There's no doubt about it.
And we're talking Omaha and Bellevue, Nebraska. It's about as innocent as America could be back in the 80s. These things just didn't happen. These things just didn't happen in our community. And here we are, 30 years later, still shaking our heads saying, how did this happen? What happened here? So absolutely incredible. So you met with Joubert 7 times. So he knew you were, did you tell him that you were writing a book about him?
I did. I told him that I was thinking about it. And you'll see in the letter that he wrote to the prison warden when he asked that their drawings be released to me. He said, there's no agreement that these drawings will be used in the book that Mark is considering writing, but that could change at a later date. So he knew that I was thinking about it. I told him what Mike Wellman, the prosecutor, had said to me is that, look, you know more about this than anybody but Joubert. You should write the book. And I said, John, I've talked to all these people. I've talked to your classmates. I think I'm going to write a book about this. And he said, I understand. And I think, again, there were questions in his mind of why was this happening? Why did he do this? And I think he thought that I could help him answer some of those questions. And that's what, I tried to do with the book. Unfortunately, after I had to testify against him in Portland, we never spoke again. And you'll read that in the book if you haven't already, Brian, is that after I had to testify against him in Portland, I walked up to his attorney and said, if it's possible, I'd like to talk to John one more time. And he said, Mark, you can talk to John Joubert after the state of Nebraska executes him.
Oh, man.
And that was it. And, I tried to talk to him in 1996 before the execution. So I'm not sure if my messages didn't get through to him or he was so upset that he didn't want to talk to me anymore after what had happened in the Ricky Stetson case. But I tried to tell him, John, you told me the truth. I told the truth. That's the way it is.
So seven interviews. Each time did you listen to him back and try and pick him apart and trying to elaborate here or elaborate there? Was he cooperative during those interviews?
Very cooperative. And at times he was funny. This is hard for people to understand, but Joubert actually had a good personality. I remember walking into one of our interviews, and this is, I write about this in the book, and he said, did you see People magazine this week? And I said, no, I don't know what you're talking about. He said, Charlie Sheen's on the cover. And Charlie Sheen said that he would rather be in a killing scene than a lovemaking scene. I'm in prison for that, Mark. God. And it's true. And then one day he said, what are you doing this weekend? I said, well, I think I'm going to play golf. It was either the next day or next weekend. And he imitated the church lady. And he said, well, isn't that special? So there were times that he was funny and, likable. And then I would start to press him on details of the murders, and he just became robotic. And the cold gray eyes just, that was it. And I said it was like a poem he never wanted to recite.
Oh, wow.
Or he never wanted to remember that he had to recite. So he became just a totally different person once I pressed him on the murders.
From him being, an outsider a lot of his life, bullied as a kid because of his size and stature, I just wonder, kind of that sociopathic, they say that they're charming. You said he has a very high IQ. He's very organized. He was in the armed forces. So he was, he got through basic training and was able to maintain some discipline through there. it seems like people like that, they also like read books to figure out how to talk, like they're play acting, how they think people should act, kind of a congeniality. And then when you, like you said, when you pressed him on his weaknesses, on his faults, on his crimes, on everything he's done, then he kind of reverts back into that, like you said, those cold, dead eyes.
Yep. And if you look, at the evidence that was confiscated from his room, the True Detective magazines, there were signs that he was drawn to all this. Yet he was a Boy Scout leader, right? He was meeting with the Boy Scout troop on the evening of one of the murders, right? And also the young boy that he was friends in the book. I don't reveal his real name, but the little boy, like you, was like, I'm so confused. Why aren't these boys fighting back? Tie me up, John, so I can try to escape. And there was this dual sense of excitement and fear in Joubert that he was tying his young friend up, just like he had tied Betty Jo Everly and Christopher Walden up. So it's just some of the dichotomies that are in this book and that he was living are just unbelievable. One moment he's trying to help the kids as a Boy Scout leader. He's got one of the kids questioning him about the murders, and so he ties the kid up, and it excites him. So I'm thinking that boy could have been a victim. Could have been a victim as well.
It's an absolutely chilling part of the book, and I don't want to give too much of it away. But yeah, he befriends this boy in the scout troop, and like you said, the kid is, it's the talk of the town. Everybody's talking about these boys being bound and murdered, and so this boy, he wants to try and escape. And so, hey, John, can you of all people to ask, John, can you tie me up? I'm gonna see if I can wiggle out of these knots. And then I feel really bad for Don Shipman, who was the man that was the leader of the scouting troop, who befriended John and invited him into his home. And they even had, like you said, a meeting on the night that he killed Christopher Walden.
It's horrific and shocking. And how can you do that? How can you commit, a vicious murder and then go to a Boy Scout troop meeting that night? And how can you kill a boy and then go to McDonald's? It's just literally unbelievable.
Mark, how did it affect you? Like for years after, you wrote the book. When did you finish the book?
The first edition of the book came out in 1990.
Yeah.
So it took me from almost 2 years to research and write the first edition of the book. And it just evolved, Brian. When he was up for execution, I updated the book. So this is actually the 6th edition of the book since 1996. And with each version, there's been, new evidence or new insights that have come out of it. So it changed me. It really did. Like you said, it's probably one of the biggest cases that I ever covered in my journalistic career right out of the gate. So it stuck with me all this time, and I just had felt a very serious sense of responsibility to finish the story. And that's why it bothered me that I knew about those drawings for all those years, but couldn't get my hands on them. And why I took the risk once I did have the drawings to put them out publicly. But I just feel strongly that this is, like I said, the last stone unturned. And I feel very happy that I've been able to close the case, if you will.
So 1996, Joubert's executed. Were you living in Atlanta at the time?
I was, and I flew back to do commentary for KMTV that night of the execution. Oh. So we were outside the prison, and there were protesters both for and against the death penalty that night.
Yeah, I was there.
And
I was there. Yeah, I was down at UNL at the time. So yeah.
So you remember, and kind of a weird, eerie feeling, because I did have a relationship with Joubert. We talked, as I said, 7 times in person. So part of me was sad that it had come to this, but part of me knew that it was justice being served. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to be there as it happened.
Mark, I was talking to some people and friends about this conversation coming up and about the book, and we're all in our 40s and we're talking about that. And some people were under the the opinion that, well, this is just opening up a scab to a wound that doesn't need to happen. And then others were like, and I'm in this camp, that this does put it to rest. This puts the John Joubert case, the investigation, the story. It finally, it does. It's the final chapter on it, releasing these drawings. And I think they are important. I think they needed to be seen. I think they needed to be analyzed. They didn't need to be locked in a drawer or in a file cabinet where they would never see the light of day and never be any good to anybody in terms of some kind of investigative value. So I admire your tenacity to get it done and to do it the right way. And I encourage everybody to go to Amazon. We'll have a link on our website and show page to A Need to Kill. The new now the new edition is the Death Row Drawings. Is that what it's called?
Exactly. It's called A Need to Kill, the Death Row Drawings. And Brian, just to put an exclamation point on what you said, this is very difficult information to look at. But this is the kind of stuff that police officers and investigators see on a regular basis. And I felt it was important that the average person, if they wanted to see it, you don't have to look at this.
Right.
But if you do, there's something to be learned here. And this is the inner workings of a deprived mind. And there's no lingering doubt, as Keith Howard said, that John Joubert was an evil person who would have continued to kill little children. And Pat Thomas told me that, the sheriff, in one of the last interviews I did with him. He said, Mark, John Joubert is a cold, ruthless killer who likes to kill little kids. If he gets out of prison, he'll kill little kids again. And again, that was one of those things that gave me cold chill bumps. And now, 30 years after the fact, I was able to prove Pat was right. And I feel good, and I feel confident that this was the right thing to do. Again, it's disturbing, but there are some very disturbing things that happen in this world. And journalism is about talking about and uncovering things people don't want to talk about. And I felt that was my job, and I felt the job is now complete.
Well, Mark, I really want to thank you for calling in and being a part of the program. It was a hard show for me to prepare for. I read the book a number of years ago, and then I got the 2013, the 30th anniversary edition. I reread that, and when I had some spare time, actually, I drove around the streets of Bellevue, and where I'm recording this right now, I'm a couple blocks away from Giles Road, much further west. But reading the book and seeing Giles Road and Cornhusker Road and Bellevue and seeing these things, it's home. And I appreciate the way you wrote the book again, with the way you covered the police and the families, but the police and how they struggled and they worked their asses off to help this community and their stress levels, their health, it's a great book for a true crime reader and also historical book too. And you've been a real gentleman, and I'm really glad that we've had this opportunity to talk tonight. And I just wish you the best of luck in the future. You've got this great business now. Now you're in Atlanta, Georgia, and you're doing with your company Creation, a marketing firm. Pretty impressive.
Well, thank you. We've been in business for almost 19 years now. We're an advertising and PR firm. So we do a lot of work with national media and helping our clients interact with the media. We do advertising. And I'm still a working journalist. I work at CBS 46 here in Atlanta doing commentary and special reports. So it's kind of a marrying of my two passions, which is, media and marketing. And I just want to thank you, Brian, for having me on the show. Omaha is my second home. I have a kinship with the people of Nebraska, and we're all tied to the story that you grew up with, and a lot of people will always remember. So I feel a duty and an honor to be a part of Nebraska, and as I said, it's my second hometown, so I enjoy going back there.
Well, if you ever come back around the summertime College World Series, look me up and I'll buy you a beer.
That sounds great, Brian. Thank you for having me, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks again, Mark Pettit, author of the book A Need to Kill, The Death Row Drawings, available on Amazon and wherever you like to go buy books. We'll put a link up on our show page, the website. It was a great conversation, one that was a little difficult for me. People that listen to the show know that I don't usually go speechless, but I was looking for words, just kind of thinking back to the 80s. I want to thank all you loyal listeners of the program. For the past 6 seasons, we've been working hard to bring you a show with subject matter and special guests like Mark that you can enjoy episode after episode. We will continue that with Season 7 and beyond. So, on behalf of our hosts, Wayne, Lori, Zip, and Doug, this is Brian. Thank you for listening.
You've been listening to the Necronomicast, a podcast hosted by a bunch of blood bags and produced by Brian Corey and Wayne Brecky. For show notes and other interesting information, go to the show page at necronomicast.com. And until next time, find something better to do with your time.